Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Bob Liodice, CEO of the ANA. Bob, it is always a pleasure to talk to you and listen to the insights that you have for marketers at the beginning of the year. And I'm really thrilled to do it this year because it seems that there's so much going on. So welcome to the show.
Well, Deb, thank you. I don't know how many years we've done this or how many versions we've done this before, but it's always a delight to chat with one of the most knowledgeable professionals in the business. So thanks for having me back.
Oh, you're so kind. You're so kind. Well, look, let's start with something that we do tend to start with most years,
Yeah.
and that's the ANA's Word of the Year, or perhaps I should say Words of the Year, because this year it was both Agentic AI and Authenticity, which is fascinating in the way they go together. So just tell us, what do these choices signal about that new balance that marketers have to strike between technology and trust? You know, what is it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm delighted that our people that really go through the process of choosing the word of the year said it really has to be about words. And what I do think this was a step back to say, let's get real about what AI is. AI is a tool. And AI is a tool that's going to help make better marketing. So let's separate the tool from how we use the tool and how we market. Now, authenticity has been part of the conversation for several years now. And it didn't necessarily rise to the top, but it became highlighted and focused when so much of the conversation had been about AI. Because when we think about the effectiveness of a brand, one of the most important things that is kind of rule 101 for marketers is to be authentic. And there was concern that AI was going to strip brand marketers of a good chunk of that authenticity. And when you think about it, before we came on air here, we talked about some of the ads that happened over Christmas that to marketers, or you should say to consumers, were viewed as being inauthentic because they were AI generated. Well, I think we've kind of tipped over the line a little bit there and maybe just had, too much complaints about or much ado about nothing. But the reality is that I think what this effectively does is allows us to remember that protocol number one is to ensure that whatever brand you market, you do so authentically, whether it is AI generated or from any other form.
A good point. And I think that authenticity certainly came up a lot in the original purpose era. Although I think I can now stratify the various purpose eras, but we may be getting to that. But there are certainly words, whether it's authenticity or I think I saw today that the new word for CEOs is transparency, which I thought was, never mind a word. I thought that was an ethos that they had to have, for decades. But I found the choice of the two together very, very interesting, and I thought it was almost poetic. Talking about authenticity, there were a number of themes that surfaced at this year's Masters, which I thought were a little bit different than some of the themes that we've had in the past. There was certainly, largely through Todd Kaplan's presentation, the return to the fundamentals of brand building. I think we saw a little bit more about the rise of culture and communities. And we also saw, which I loved, was purpose evolving from preaching to participation, which I think is maybe is an expansion of authenticity, but that's something else. So do you see these themes continuing in 2026, or are they shifting in some way, or just curious?
Yeah, it's a big, broad, bold question, and it's the right one to have. Um, let's talk about brand building. We sometimes lose ourselves in shiny object mentality. a couple of years ago, it was the metaverse. Then AI kind of took over. And when you think about it, is we love, I mean, we're like moth to a light bulb sometimes when all these glitzy new things come along, and we lose sight of what is the most important thing that we have to do as marketers is to brand build. Now, brand building is an interesting set of words, and we often talk about it at the A&A. And we start by saying, well, what do you mean by brand building? Define brand building. Well, there really isn't necessarily a common definition to what building a brand is. Some would default to saying, well, it's to grow your revenue or sell more boxes. Others may say it's the economic value of a brand that over the course of time gets appropriately measured. And others say it's about consumer acceptance and key takeaways from how much attribution consumers give to a particular brand. And it's rather interesting that we don't necessarily have a common definition for brand building. But when you take all of those potential definitions and you start to merge them together, you get a clear respect for the fact that what marketers do with their primary responsibility is to build brands. And I do agree with you. I think that there is a greater degree of intensification around that because brands are differentiators. You could think about different car companies and brands differentiate. You could think about different insurance companies, which seamlessly have the same type of product, but you have different perceptions of them based upon how they are communicated over video or commercials or wherever. And the reality is that despite the glitziness of the tools that we often get ourselves lost into, I do believe that there is a reappreciation for brand. Brand as the centerpiece for everything that we do, for driving economic value for shareholders. You think of that continuum between consumer and the ability for a brand to deliver returns to the shareholders that cascades through the marketer, through the agency, up through the CFO, through the CEO, and then to the shareholders. That essential linkage is the most important thing that we have to recognize as brand builders. Now, along the way, there are other things that we also capture in our conversation. And you mentioned culture, and you mentioned communities and things of that nature. And culture is foundational to that connection with consumers because it is cultural, the way we talk to consumers and how we, for example, in the United States, we speak to different cultures as part of our marketing targeting priorities. We do target various consumers. We have to. We just can't treat the universe of consumers as one big blob. We have to talk about whether they're young or old, whether they're Hispanic or they're African American or they're Asian American, whether they're high income or low income. I mean, we always used to use in the old days, so to speak, women 18 to 49, which is really very rarely talked about in these days. But when we so-called target on any of these particular groups, we have to bring that cultural aspect into play. So I do think that culture is a part of brand building. But culture got knocked around a little bit this year as a result of the kind of 2-year assault on, we'll call it DE&I for the moment, that started with the Supreme Court essentially revoking affirmative action, running through what the DEI priorities are through the current administration, et cetera. But it does have an impact on the way marketers think about culture. The last thing I believe you talked about was purpose. We will never lose purpose. It will be prioritized more or less in any one particular year. But I do think that the essence of the marketing community is essentially to respect the consumer, that in fact, your brand should be more than just be about profit. It is about having that linkage to do good, to do well by society. You know, a few years ago, we talked about society in a far more robust way as being a force for growth and a force for good. While there's less conversation these days about being a force for good, I do think it is part of the fabric of the way brand marketers think about their relationship with their targeted consumers and their relationship with society.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that issues, whether they are, I think every brand marketer has to, the table stakes now are, what are we doing for our community? Is this sustainable? Can we manufacture this in a different way? I mean, it's just how one has to think. And even though a lot of the focus on purpose came out of COVID at a very difficult time, I do think that it has evolved in a very, very interesting way. I'll make one comment that because I do want to get to what you have in mind for 2026, but I'll make one comment in that this year, one of the things that truly surprised me is I've been following the Havas Meaningful Brand Study for the 17 years that it's been in existence. And this year, and again, I may get the numbers wrong, but this year, because they do it country by country, and in the US, I think that the top line note was that 73% of consumers couldn't care less if four of their five favorite brands disappeared. Now, if that isn't a wake-up call for marketers and for the differentiation that comes from brand building, not only brand building, but serving real consumer needs and wants and making what you do so much a part of their day that they almost don't even think about it. I just found that just to be just
Can I
stunning.
jump on that a second? Because I think
Sure.
there, this is one where I would love to see the raw data. And why I say that's important is because it's a question of who that they surveyed in that report. In my general opinion, if you were talking to an older consumer, I doubt those would be their results. I think brands have a legacy history with older consumers. If you talk to the younger consumer that is infatuated by TikTok and Instagram and a lot of social media, I probably could subscribe to the fact that brands are far less important to them. And when we think about the long-term brand building efforts that marketers have to think about, their primary goal is to create those very distinct relationships with those younger consumers, because someday they will be older consumers. And if nobody cares about brands, then marketing will be a dying industry over the course of time.
You bring up something very interesting because I've been doing a little bit of work with what I'm calling Gen More or Gen More Plus, and the 50 you mentioned women 18 to 49 a minute ago. The 50 plus consumer today is a very, very different consumer, and it actually comprises a number of generations, including Gen X, not only boomers, but boomers and beyond, but Gen X, which was one of the first truly digital generations, and also millennials will be turning 50 in a couple of years. When you talk about loyalty, some of those Gen Xers are not as familiar with some of the brands that their slightly older peers may have been. And I think it's very interesting because you talk about communities. Well, 50 plus is not what we thought of as 50 in the past, but it's also the most moneyed and most consumer oriented group
Yes.
ever. And I'm always surprised that when marketers look for growth in brand building, that there aren't ways that they think of authentically involving this audience, which is not a senior audience. It's an audience that is looking for some humor and perhaps some nostalgia. And I won't forget that last year's Super Bowl, I believe it was Adweek who called it the Silver Super Bowl, because more than half of the ads featured stars
Right.
or people in commercials that were clearly over 50. And I'd love to know if those ads resonated as much with the 50 plus versus the 50 under. But anyway, we digress.
Yeah.
But I find it fascinating, and I think it is a major marketing issue, particularly as one of the ANA's responsibilities is
Yep.
growth. But before we talk about the year ahead, how would you characterize 2025 for the marketing industry beyond AI, unless AI was so significant that there was nothing else to talk about?
Yeah, there's always a ton of things to talk about in any one year. Obviously, AI commanded so much of the language and the conversation that we had, and as it should. Um, and I'll just spend a minute on that, and then we'll talk about some other things. Um, AI was a major door opener for the marketing industry, as it was for a lot of places. But it is a door opener because it provides that glimpse at what next generation marketing can be about. It opens up the door of possibilities of what can be done. And whether it can be done or will be done is something to be seen, and it will be the foundation for the evolution of marketing. But it is, in and of itself, extraordinarily transformative. On one hand, it could produce very different creative, as we've talked about. It opens up the imagination in ways that marketers, through their agencies or other forms, could probably never begin to think about. But it also has incredible consequences for how we operate as a business enterprise. Well, it's clearly can help you plan your media. It could certainly help you in your video production abilities. It will help you manage the digital media supply chain with greater efficiencies and opportunities. All of those we're probably barely scratching the surface on. But in and of itself, it stimulates the imagination about the possibilities to come. And I think, very generically talked about it as a tool. It is far more than a tool. It's dynamite. It's explosive. It's charismatic in so many different ways. That being said, um, there were lots of other things that took place in 2025 that don't necessarily get the headlines. For one, I think that was a greater appreciation for some of what I like to call the scientific side of marketing. We always say marketing is about art and science. And I do think that data and measurement also ratcheted up a lot in the minds of many marketers in 2025. And I think data, which is really the blood, the lifeblood of what marketing is about, is getting not only greater appreciation, but essentially greater organic interest in how best to think about great, excellent data strategy. And there are lots of things that is starting to get attention, such as data clean rooms, first party data, data strategy. And now, into themselves, they're all relatively flat islands. But when you start to think about it, there is a growing consensus that we need to have a more robust vision of how to be able to leverage data. One of the great ways that we're thinking about is in the measurement arena. And one of the things that we've been working on for 6, 7 years is something called Aquila, which is our cross-media measurement study, which is just one of many measurement initiatives across the industry. But what we see is the ability to leverage the unification of data and measurement to help us all make better decisions. And in the end, that's what a marketer's about. Marketers have thousands of choices. I mean, that's really the organic nature of what we do. We have thousands of choices. We have to pick one or two out of those choices. Well, what's going to hone that decision-making capability? It's going to be how you interpret the data that's going to leverage your future outcomes. And that connection of data and measurement to outcomes, I think, has certainly gained greater appreciation as part of 2025. Not necessarily headline grabbing, but it's kind of what we're seeing behind the scenes. The other thing which I'll say was on the other side, and we already alluded to a little bit of this, is the pullback in inclusive marketing. And inclusive marketing essentially being under the broader umbrella of marketing to various targets, as we talked about, Hispanics, African Americans, uh, people of all colors and ages, et cetera, which had great momentum in the early 2020s as we focused in on diversity as a core strategy, which can't talk about that anymore. Everybody is kind of pulling back from that. It's become an unfortunate word in the way marketers either talk or don't talk about the cultural relevance. Now, why am I raising that? There are a lot of empirical studies that say inclusive marketing is perhaps the most significant growth engine that a brand should embrace. It drives more growth than almost any other tool or strategy that you can be out there. Yet, we as marketers are cautious about what we invest, how we invest. Will anybody notice? Does it matter politically? And unfortunately, there's been a reservation about embracing inclusive marketing because a particular company is somewhat on the defensive, considering all the negative rhetoric that has come out of the conversation. So if you ask me for a couple of headlines, those would be some of those about 2025 that I think bring character for the year, both on the positive and the negative.
Now that's a very, very different balance, but I guess we'll have to smile and say that AI will figure that all out for us, you know. Well, what's keeping CMOs up at night or marketers up at night now? I remember at Masters, Peter Hinson, who I believe was your first speaker, called today the never normal world of disruption and cultural fatigue and fragmented attention. So, so what's keeping him up as we look at the year ahead?
Just said it.
I know, I know,
But
I know.
let's dig a little deeper into that. And it's not that it's something new. Um, I've always
Just
said that
faster. It's faster, I think.
that's very true. But I think it's actually an age-old problem for a CMO. I think that the CMOs have one of the toughest jobs in any corporation. And I say it respectfully because if you think about what it is that they're being asked to do, they're being asked in a short window of time to elevate growth. Now, if you believe that strong brands drive growth, and we've proved that every which way to Sunday, then that requires the ability to appreciate that brand building takes time. And you don't generate a great brand over. If you have a mediocre brand and your goal is to develop a great brand, that's going to take a couple of years. And we know that CMOs don't necessarily get a couple of years to develop a great brand. And the way what they have to manage under that, when you think about not only the brand itself, but agencies and measurement tools and technology and talent, et cetera. Well, the role and job of a CMO is enormously complex, and their ability to harness expertise in helping to make those decisions would keep me up at night if I was a CMO. And I think it's part of the issue why the average tenure, depending upon who you reference these days, is, I don't know, 40 months or thereabouts. I think Greg Welch's company is kind of kingpin of measuring CMO tenure. So I think it's the complexity that a senior marketer has to deal with that in and of itself is what keeps them up at night. And that leads to decisions. Well, how much do I invest behind brand and how much do I invest behind performance? What vehicles do I use? I mean, you think about the media landscape, and there are so many ways that you can communicate with your audiences. Do I want 2-second ads on Facebook, or do I want, very long form video ads to appear on CTV? Well, how do you make those choices? How do you make those decisions? Well, how do I measure one versus the other? Is there a way to be able to bring some science into the decision-making process? I'm exhausted just thinking about it and talking about it. And I think that that's really why many CMOs don't get much sleep, because of the level of complexity and choices that they have to make in order to be able to develop their businesses and brands.
Do you think that CEOs have changed their view of CMOs?
Um, Modestly, for the positive. I do believe that in the, we'll call it explosion of AI, that the marketing community adapted the fastest inside a particular corporation. And I think they do see the CMO as being a champion of being able to leverage AI in order to achieve growth. And let's talk about growth for a moment. Growth is more than just pushing more boxes out the door and generating revenue. It's also about eliminating waste and enhancing productivity. It's the subtraction of those things that detract from your bottom line and top line performance. And it's enhancing, obviously, the things that add more to that. And often we forget that it is about eliminating the waste and productivity. And, before we talked a little bit about transparency. Well, think about the lack of transparency that exists within our ecosystem. Many marketers can't get a hold of log level data, which is the key for unlocking many of the decisions in their digital media supply chain. Okay, that's a lack of transparency. Do we think that the agency DSP SSP combo within that supply chain is transparent in terms of how decisions are made and where those digital ads are going? They don't know. Marketers do not know. We found that out through our programmatic media study 2 and 3 years ago, where many media players do not understand the number of websites to where their ads go. Thousands. Now, go back to another era that you and I grew up in. Used to have, what, 7 magazines that we used to publish and 3 networks and a handful of local radio stations? Well, we knew where every ad appeared. Do marketers know that today? No. There is great obfuscation in the marketplace, and that lack of transparency diminishes a marketer's ability to make great decisions that produce great outcomes. And so when we think about the totality of that very complex, very confusing marketplace, growth is not optimized. It's sub-optimized, and as a result, we're continuing to try to find a way to be able to assimilate all of that organization data to help us make better decisions. And there's the rub for what a CMO has to do in order to be able to unleash their great marketing to optimize their consumer delivery and build renewed loyalty among consumers.
Keep their brand promise. to bring it full circle.
There you go.
Interesting that you say that, because this might have, obviously, I've heard you talk about growth for a very long time. And this might be the first time in more of an AI age that you talked about growth also in terms of weeding out some of the inefficiencies. This, I think, becomes an interesting transition to how we consider talent,
Mm.
because I recently had a conversation with someone at an ad agency in London, a CEO of an ad agency in London, who actually was talking a little bit about how, and this is the agency side, but I don't think it's that different from a marketing department, how in terms of efficiency now, AI can do a number of roles that perhaps some entry level people had done. And he was just concerned about, as a human being and a father, about how the lifeblood of agencies in particular, and probably marketing departments, were young people. And now they can work at home. Now their jobs in some ways are being replaced. And I realize you need senior people to evaluate things and have the experience and one thing and another. But he was worried that, how do they learn? How do they start to learn the industry if there's not as much of an office community? If some of their roles, and my suggestion off the top of the bat was maybe they should do more with customer service, because God knows we need a lot more customer service today, with real human beings. But I'm not saying that's going to solve it, but it does add an interesting element to talent. And I know that talent has mattered to you for a very long time and mattered to the ANA and your various divisions. So, and I also remember that in the past I asked you if you had a limitless budget where you would put more money, and you would often say it would be in talent. So now what happens? Now what happens? This is a really different time.
Yeah. You covered a lot in your question, and
I'm not even sure it was a question. I think it was just a chat.
okay, true, fair point. Um, I still think that talent is the most important priority. Um, Forget about machine learning. Human learning is by far the most important thing that we have to do, because it's humans that are making the decisions. And if we do not have a capable workforce, if we do not have a marketing ecosystem that has the very best of skills and the very best ability to make those decisions, doesn't matter how good AI or machine learning or any other technology system is going to be, you're not going to be a great marketer, and your outcomes are going to be relatively weak. But what you talked about was essentially, talent is somewhat sub-optimized by remote learning, and it's harder to learn from peers and colleagues, even though that more people are starting to get back to the office more so than ever. And we also think about the fact that AI is displacing key workers, particularly at the entry-level positions, where there's a lot more, we'll call it routine work, that is now being supplemented or supplanted by AI, and can probably continue to do so, which essentially is going to be the case for almost all industries, not just marketing. ANA has an educational foundation which essentially works to bridge universities to the industry. And the key question is that if the lowest level, the entry level, is essentially runs the risk of being supplanted, how are the new fresh marketers that come into the industry really going to learn? I think we're going to see in 2026, the evolution of how that in fact takes place. Um, AI is not the only revolution that we've had in our history, whether you want to call it the Industrial Revolution or modern industry methods coming to the forefront, or even the advent of personal computers or digital and social marketing, etc. There are many ways to learn, plenty of ways. And that's part of the reason we're in business, for example, is essentially to build better marketers. Because when we look at the universe of marketers out there, we recognize quite clearly that they do not necessarily have the skills to wrestle with the rapid advancement of technology, of data, of measurement within the ecosystem, and be able to cobble it all together to make the greatest decisions possible for a brand. They don't have that. And unfortunately, CMOs are not necessarily prioritizing existing marketers to grow and to learn from others. You know, the essence of the A&A, and this is not a promotion for the A&A, but the way I learn, because I'm not a practicing marketer from day to day, other than, I do try to market the A&A, but I learn from others. The community of marketers is what we're about, is to create the community of marketers so that we can learn the various strategies and the various tactics and the various ways that marketers can execute. That if you stay in your own castle, you will never have the ability to understand what's in the marketplace. You can read about something generically in a publication or online, but will you understand the fabric of how that gets there? No, you only do that through connection with others. That is a fascinating, brilliant way that talent can learn. And so maybe the entry-level positions will be smaller. They won't go away. They'll just be smaller. We get that. That's part of what the old saying of creative destruction is about. They will get smaller, and there will be a new generation of other things that entry-level people will do. Because they will have to learn, for example, how to manage data and measurement and technology and media if, in fact, they're going to rise. So let's not wring our hands and saying, the party's over, just kind of just throw in the towel. No, we have to be adept at finding out different places that the community of marketers and agencies and others can learn from. And whether it's additional course taking, or as I said, going to conferences or other types of training sessions or whatever, there is a ton out there for those to learn from. And that's not to say that senior marketers get a pass either, because they have to learn how to harness data and technology and measurement and media and all the scientific signs of things that they did not grow up with. And so how are they making senior executive decisions for all of these things that is not necessarily organic to their way of life? So I think what this means is that as an industry, we're going to need to take some right turns and some left turns, and to say, hey, the old way is not dead, but it is somewhat diminished, and that we have to open up different pathways. Okay. That shouldn't be scary. Why? Well, when we went from analog, radio, television, print to digital and social media, we all had to learn new things, and we did. And by the way, we have been rather successful in learning about those, because now that's the dominant form of media marketing spend. So I am not fearful of it. I think it is part of our DNA to constantly learn. The key is, particularly for senior marketers, you have to emphasize it as cornerstone, mandatory thing that has to happen within the marketing organization. There has to be a focus on learning and education and skill building. That is a requirement that many marketers, senior marketers in particular, lose sight of, because there's so many other things that are going on in the system. But to me, that's the most important.
That's and I know you've been such an advocate, for not only training but the community building. I mean, I've found through my own experience with the Internationalist that there's a trust factor in the human element, let's call it that. The trust, of course, is that you talk to another marketer and you get friendly and they share some of the mistakes, and they don't want to say it out loud, but then you suddenly empathize and you say, okay, All right, I can learn from that. And you suddenly start swapping stories. And I think that that is back, to the human dimension. But let me just get just quickly, because I
Sure.
think we're as usual running out of time.
All right, I have
But
some time if you need more, but go ahead.
just what are three new initiatives or three priorities for the ANA in the coming year?
Great question. One of, not one of, the most important one for the ANA is this Aquila project, which is essentially going to be ready sometime mid part of the year for a broad embrace by the industry. And and Aquila is our, for those that don't know about it, again, is our cross media measurement uh, for-profit business enterprise that has been set up as a separate company, but it is leveraged global technology to create uh, in a very, very complex technological kind of way, essentially getting at the heart of deduplicating reach and frequency so that we understand organically what has worked and what is not. And it is not clouded by impressions that have high levels of frequency in various areas. That deduplication process is technologically very, very difficult when you're running across media. So, okay, television to digital, like social media, but then you have radio, then you have print, you have other media. The ability to do that deduplication is a extraordinarily difficult process that hasn't necessarily been um, superbly managed in the past. And we're attempting to raise the bar, and we're doing this in concert with Google and Meta and TikTok and Amazon and key partners like ComScore and Kantar and Accenture. So there are a lot of places that we're focusing this time and attention. And what this will do is this will unlock $50 billion worth of productivity over the next 3 years. That's how powerful this thing is. And I'm sure there'll be many other applications that we'll think of down the road. Secondly, it goes back to a topic we spent a lot of time and attention on, is in talent. And one of the things that, with the help of AI, that we're going to be focusing in is understanding what you need as an individual and as a brand. So we are creating technologically based systems that will say, hey, I am fabulous at measurement, but I'm not really very good at brand building. And so what that will allow an individual to do is to make choices about where you should focus your personal growth and development initiatives. I want to do more brand building and far less in some of the technologically or measurement-based areas. The same thing can go for brand, and is we want to be able to create this collective system so that we can have a number of brand marketers input to a technology-based system that will say, hey, company X, you're really good at brand building, but you're really not very good at data excellence. So that will lead the CMO to say, okay, we need to spend more time on how do we develop a great data strategy and make people better at data management. And so that's kind of a second priority. The list of other things that we have our time and attention on, I'm just going to run through them because they're really fascinating and I think very, very important for us. And so it's not necessarily a hard three, but we are spending time in the concept of brand finance because we do believe the economic value of a brand is a measurement that senior marketers need to embrace. Because to us, the ability to measure whether you're being a successful brand is not just on income and revenue, it's about the asset of a brand, the economic value of a brand. I mean, the economic value of Apple is $600 billion, and Interbrand has measured that. But what we need to do is to be able to build a system that every brand, and there are thousands and thousands of brands out there, can measure themselves. the focus in on media. We still focus very heavily on programmatic media and developing methodologies for marketers to come in. And we've created a system with an organization called Tag TrustNet. You give us your data and we can technologically bring to you where you have great inefficiencies. And we've had 40 marketers so far that have been part of this system. And on average, they have improved the productivity of their media spend, programmatic media spend, by 20 to 25%. We will be dealing very extensively into retail media, which is majorly chaotic out there. Why? Because there's no standardization. And retail media networks have exploded, but without any necessarily commonality to them. And we have a very, very heavy emphasis at being able to focus in on that side of it. We do believe there is a greater role for inclusive marketing, and we want to build the appreciation for that. And so what we've done is we've merged our 3 inclusive marketing units of CHER, AIM, and ANA's multicultural unit to create one focused, powerful unit called the See All Marketing Alliance, which was announced in October. And that group is essentially hitting the ground as we speak at this moment. And finally, and not least, is the need to really understand how to become far better at data. I think data has been, we kind of acknowledge how important it is, but we have to create a data excellence system that can be appreciated by the entire marketplace. And that includes data providers that are out there. That includes those organizations that are intent on building better measurement systems, and organically for marketers about how to evaluate and make choices for their brand media decisions. So there's a lot that's out there, and I could go on for hours to talk about those priorities, but those are the things that come to mind very, very quickly.
Sounds like you're creating a lot of new systems, which can't be very easy. So, and again, I always remember that you say, if you can't measure it, then, yeah, it doesn't amount to anything. So that's well, congratulations to you. I mean, that's extraordinary work. Well, we opened our conversation with the ANA's words of the year,
Yeah.
but I'd love to end it with a personal word from you in terms of what you might think a word or phrase would characterize 2026 for marketers.
There are 2 that come to mind. One which will be kind of far out there. The other is kind of standard. The far out there one is revolutionary. I do think that 26 is going to be a year of revolution. And I don't mean that in the American Revolution type of sense. I mean that in the sense of I think the past 2 years have been years of divergence where we've gone through a lot of mind-expanding ways to think about effectively marketing and managing our businesses. I think 26 is about convergence, where the various ways, the wider dimensional thinking for how we evaluate marketing and make those decisions will start to come together in a revolutionary kind of way. And we will become far better marketers because we have decided to elevate our courage and make bold, revolutionary types of decisions to separate us. Why is that important? Well, I grew up in an era where what you aspire to as a marketer would be to create temporary competitive advantages, or TCAs, as we used to call them. And what that provided you was a window that allowed you to be better than your competition. And for their ability to follow was always going to take time because we lived in an analog world. But now in a highly technical digital world, those temporary competitive advantages are extraordinarily temporary, and they're like in seconds, milliseconds these days. So we have to figure out how to rebuild loyalty. We spoke about that earlier, that perhaps the younger segment of society is not as necessarily brand loyal as maybe older consumers. So that revolution is important to help distinguish how a particular brand markets itself and provides at least the semblance of alternative ways that perhaps the industry will follow and evolve in a more optimum way. The second word is one that does not get enough attention. It may sound very pedestrian, but it's the focus in on outcomes. Often we zero in on process. This process, that process, the shiny object, even AI is part of a process. But what we really need to be about is what we said before, CEOs and shareholders, they want outcomes. We're investing $1 trillion in marketing in the US, all kinds of marketing. We better get outcomes for that. That's our return on investment. And I know ROI means lots of things to lots of people, but when you say the word outcomes, those are the hard and fast deliverables that say, what are you going to do for me? What outcomes are you going to deliver for me in the year ahead? And if I can get that focus and say, whether it is I'm going to deliver 10% revenue growth or I'm going to give you a greater share of market, those are outcomes that cannot be ignored. They must be embraced and they must be acted upon.
I think those are the two together work brilliantly, and I'm looking forward to seeing 2026. Not only from the standpoint of what the ANA can achieve, but also where this is in the evolution of marketing and branding. So I think we're on to a very interesting year. So with that, I thank you again for always taking the time to do this. And to share these insights, because I know that people are concerned about them. So again, a pleasure to talk to you as always. And maybe what we should do is we should meet halfway, after Cannes or something, and see and revisit these to see if they need to be adjusted, or maybe they're coming true faster than we ever thought.
I would welcome that. So yes, let's get together in July and swap
Do it
notes.
again.
Do it one
Okay,
more time.
that sounds great. All
It's a
right,
day.
Bob, good to see you, and a great 2026 to you in the ANA.
You as well, my friend. Thank you so very much.
A pleasure, a pleasure. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.